A mafia boss spent millions trying to fix his late brother's Ferrari. Every mechanic in the city failed him. What he didn't know, the maid's daughter had noticed something in the first 3 minutes that nobody else had in 14 months. And that one quiet observation was about to change both their lives forever. The Ferrari screamed. Not the good kind of scream, not the throaty, powerful roar that turns heads on Fifth Avenue and makes grown men forget their names. This was something uglier. A cough, a sputter, then silence. Dead silence. Anthony DeLuca stood on the steps of his Manhattan penthouse, still in his dinner jacket, a glass of scotch in his hand that he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. He watched his men scramble around the car like nervous ants, popping the hood, checking wires, shouting words like fuel injector and ECU module, as if they had any idea what those things meant. They didn't. Tony knew that. He knew it, the same way he knew everything about the people who worked for him. Completely and with quiet disappointment. 14 months, he said. Nobody heard him. 14 months. His head of security, Marco, looked up from behind the raised hood. Boss, we'll get Caruso back out here first thing in the... Caruso charged me $280,000. Tony's voice was calm. That was always the warning sign. Not the yelling, not the throwing things. The calm. $280,000, Marco. And the car still won't start. Marco had no answer for that. Smart man. The 1971 Ferrari 365 GTB/4, a Daytona, cherry red, immaculate bodywork, sat there under the penthouse's entrance lights, like a beautiful, broken promise. Tony's younger brother, Sal, had driven it for 6 years before the night 3 men put 4 bullets in him outside a restaurant in Queens. Nobody had been charged. Nobody ever would be. That was the nature of their world. Tony had kept the car. He wasn't sure why at first. Maybe guilt. Maybe he just wasn't ready to let go of the last thing that still smelled like Sal. Motor oil, leather, and that cheap pine air freshener Sal always used, even in a car worth more than most people's houses. But then the problem started. First, it was an electrical fault. A technician in New Jersey spent 6 weeks rewiring half the dashboard. Fixed, they said. 3 weeks later, the engine cut out on the highway. Then it was the fuel system. Then the ignition. Then something nobody could properly explain. The car would run perfectly for exactly 11 minutes before dying like someone had flipped a switch. 11 minutes. Every single time. Tony had stopped believing in coincidences a long time ago. He took a slow sip of his scotch and stared at the car. The men around it were just background noise now, shifting shadows under bright lights, doing nothing useful. Behind him, the penthouse door opened. Rosa Carter stepped out quietly, the way she always did everything, without disturbing the air around her. She'd been Tony's housekeeper for 11 years. Small woman, careful eyes, hair always pulled back tight. She held a folded dinner napkin she'd probably come out to retrieve from somewhere, and when she saw the scene on the driveway, she simply stopped and waited, the way a person learns to wait when they've spent years reading a room before entering it. And beside her, half a step behind, like she hadn't decided yet whether to come outside or not, stood Rosa's daughter. Emily Carter was 23. She'd been visiting her mother for the past week, sleeping in the small staff room on the east side of the building. Tony had seen her twice in passing, once in the hallway, carrying groceries, once reading a book on the service stairs. He hadn't given her much thought. There were always people in the periphery of his life. That was just how it was. But now she was looking at the Ferrari. Not the way women usually looked at it, with polite admiration or discomfort, or the careful blankness of people who didn't want to ask questions. She was studying it, her head slightly tilted, eyes moving from the front wheel arch, up the hood, across the roofline, back down to the rear quarter panel. Like she was reading it. Tony noticed, the way he noticed everything. He filed it away without reacting. "Get the flatbed," he told Marco. Brooklyn Garage, first thing tomorrow. Tell Vito I want his best man, not whoever he sends for regular jobs. His best. Yes, boss. The men moved. The car would be towed. Again. Tony turned to go back inside, pausing briefly at the door. He didn't look at Emily, but she was still looking at the car. Even as the tow truck reversed up the driveway, cables hooking under the Ferrari's frame, even as the red taillights of the flatbed disappeared around the corner, she was still watching. Her eyes had settled on one specific spot. The dashboard, behind the glass. Something near the panel on the driver's side. Tony was already back inside. He didn't know it yet, but the woman who would finally solve a 14-month mystery, expose a murder, and unravel a betrayal buried inside his own organization, had just arrived. And she'd noticed something in the first 3 minutes. Vito Marchese's garage didn't have a sign. It didn't need one. In certain circles, the kind of circles where money moved without receipts and problems disappeared without paperwork, everyone knew where it was. A converted warehouse off a dead-end street in Red Hook, sandwiched between a shipping container yard and a building that had been under renovation for 6 consecutive years. The kind of place that existed in plain sight because the right people had decided it should. Tony arrived at 7:15 in a black Escalade, 2 cars behind him carrying 4 men each. Not because he expected trouble, just because Anthony DeLuca hadn't gone anywhere without protection since he was 19 years old, and old habits had a way of becoming identity. The Ferrari was already there, sitting on the garage floor under a rack of industrial lights, looking, as it always did, like something that belonged in a museum rather than a mechanic's bay. Vito himself was crouched beside the driver's side door when Tony walked in, running his fingers along the sill like a doctor checking a pulse. "Tell me something good, Vito." Vito stood up. He was a broad man, late 50s, with hands so permanently stained with grease they looked tattooed. He'd been working on high-end Italian cars since before Tony was born, and he carried that expertise the way certain men carry age, not as a burden, but as authority. "I'll tell you what I see," Vito said carefully. "Not what you want to hear." "When have I ever wanted that?" Vito almost smiled. "Almost. The ignition system has been replaced correctly. The fuel lines are clean. Whoever worked on it last, they knew what they were doing, technically." He paused. "But she keeps dying at the same point, every time. 11 minutes. "I know. That's not mechanical failure, Tony. That's a pattern." "So fix the pattern." Vito exhaled slowly. "I'm going to pull the ECU, replace the relay cluster, and check the secondary fuse box behind the firewall. There's also a grounding issue I want to trace. Could take most of the day." "Then take most of the day." Tony looked at the car for a moment, just a beat longer than necessary, then walked to the far side of the garage where a battered table held a coffee machine that had no business being in a place this rough. He poured himself a cup and didn't taste it. He hadn't slept. Rosa arrived at 8:30. She hadn't been asked to come. Tony hadn't even known she was planning to. But Rosa had a way of appearing where she was needed, silently and without explanation, and Tony had long since stopped questioning it. She brought food, sandwiches wrapped in foil, a thermos of proper coffee, and set it on the table without a word before moving to speak quietly with one of the men near the door. Emily was with her. She stepped into the garage the way she'd stepped onto the penthouse steps the night before, carefully, measuring the space before committing to it. She was dressed simply, dark jeans and a gray jacket, hair pulled back. She had her mother's eyes, sharp, observant, the kind that didn't miss things even when they pretended to. Tony noticed her notice the car. Again, that same focused attention. Not curiosity, exactly. Something more purposeful. She drifted toward it gradually, the way you drift toward something when you don't want anyone to see how interested you actually are. She stopped near the front quarter panel, hands in her jacket pockets, and just listened. To Vito. To his apprentice. To the sounds the car made when they turned the ignition briefly to test a relay. She wasn't in the way. She wasn't speaking. She was simply present and absorbing. Tony watched her for a moment, then looked away. He had bigger things to think about. By 2 p.m, Vito had replaced the ECU, the full relay cluster, reseated every ground wire in the electrical system, and cleared a fault code that had apparently been living in the car's brain like a stubborn ghost. His apprentice had been under the dashboard for 3 hours straight. 2 other mechanics had been pulled off other jobs to help trace the wiring harness end to end. When Vito finally straightened up and said, "Starter," the whole garage went quiet. The engine turned over. It caught. That sound, that deep, resonant, perfectly tuned V12, filled the garage like a living thing. Several of Tony's men broke into grins. Marco actually clapped once. Even Vito allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction. Tony stood very still and said nothing. He'd heard this before. He looked at his watch and waited. 4 minutes passed. The engines sang, beautiful and steady. 7 minutes, still running. At 9 minutes, Tony set his coffee cup down slowly. At 10 minutes, he crossed his arms. At 11 minutes and 14 seconds, the engine coughed once, shuddered, and died. The garage went absolutely silent. Then Tony moved. He crossed the floor in 6 strides and grabbed Vito by the collar of his workshirt. And Vito, to his credit, didn't flinch, because he was the kind of man who'd been grabbed before and knew that flinching only made it worse. "What did you do?" "Tony, what did you do that was different from every other guy I paid to fix this car?" His voice cracked on the last word, not with rage, with something rawer than that, something that had no business being in a garage in Red Hook. "Nothing. You did nothing different. Because nobody can fix this. Because it won't be fixed." He released Vito, stepped back, straightened his jacket. The men around him looked at the floor, the walls, anywhere but at their boss. Tony stood in the middle of the garage and stared at the car, and for just a few seconds, barely enough to catch if you weren't already watching him, his expression wasn't anger. It was grief. Raw, unguarded, exhausted grief. The face of a man who hadn't been trying to fix a car for 14 months. He'd been trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away from him, over and over, in the same 11-minute loop. Emily saw it. She was standing 10 feet away near the front of the car, and she was watching Tony, not the engine, not the mechanics, not the chaos of the moment. Him. And her expression had shifted from focused to something quieter, something that understood. She looked back at the car. Then, almost to herself, so quietly that only someone standing close enough would catch it, she murmured, "The car's not broken." Nobody heard her, except Tony. He turned his head slowly and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. She wasn't looking back at him. She was staring at the dashboard again, at that same spot she'd been staring at since last night. "What did you say?" Tony asked. Emily hesitated, glanced at her mother, who was watching with wide, careful eyes. Then she looked at Tony. "I said the car isn't broken." She held his gaze steadily. "Someone made it this way. On purpose." The garage was still quiet, but now it was a different kind of quiet. Nobody spoke on the ride back. Tony sat in the front passenger seat of the Escalade, one elbow on the window ledge, 2 fingers pressed against his temple, the kind of stillness that meant his brain was running at full speed while the rest of him refused to show it. Marco drove. The other men in the back seat studied their phones with unusual intensity, performing busyness, doing anything to avoid accidentally making eye contact with the boss. The Ferrari rode behind them on the flatbed. Again. Tony hadn't responded to Emily's comment in the garage. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough to make Rosa step slightly forward in quiet, maternal alarm. And then he'd simply turned away and told Marco to get the car loaded. But he hadn't forgotten what she said. Someone made it this way, on purpose. He turned it over in his mind the way you turn over a stone you're not sure you want to look under. Because if she was right, and something in the back of his skull was telling him she might be, then 14 months of failed repairs weren't bad luck. They weren't incompetence. They were exactly what someone had intended. And that changed everything. The DeLuca estate sat behind iron gates in a quiet stretch of Upper Manhattan, not flashy by the standards of men in Tony's position. Sal had always teased him about that. "You run half the East Coast and you live like a retired accountant," he used to say, laughing. Tony had never cared much for display. Power didn't need decoration. It just needed to be real. The private garage sat at the back of the property, a separate structure, climate-controlled, housing 6 cars in various states of either perfection or neglect. The Ferrari was unloaded and rolled inside by 2 of Tony's men, who then quietly disappeared as instructed. Tony went inside to make calls. Rosa began her afternoon work. The estate didn't stop running because the boss was in a dark mood. If anything, it needed more careful management. She moved through the main hallways with her usual quiet efficiency, and Emily followed, helping where she could, carrying a cleaning caddy and saying very little. But her eyes kept drifting toward the garage. It was Rosa who gave her the opening, unintentionally. "The floor near the garage side door needs mopping," she said, not looking up from the linen cupboard she was organizing. "The men tracked oil in this morning." Emily took the mop bucket without a word. The side door of the garage was propped open by a brick. Ventilation, probably, since someone had been running the engine earlier. Emily stepped inside, mop in hand, and stopped. The Ferrari sat under the garage's overhead lights like a painting. Even still, even silent, there was something magnetic about it. The red was deep and serious in this light. Not flashy, not loud. The kind of red that meant something. She did what she was supposed to do. She mopped the oil-stained concrete near the door. She worked slowly and methodically, and she did not look at the car. For about 4 minutes. Then she set the mop against the wall and walked over. She didn't touch it. Not at first. She just moved around it slowly, the way she'd been doing since last night, studying it section by section. The bodywork was genuine and largely original. Sal DeLuca had kept it well. Every panel line was where it should be, every chrome detail intact. Whoever had cared for this car had cared for it seriously. She crouched beside the driver's door. The interior was original leather, aged but preserved, deep tan, no serious cracking. The dashboard was a beautiful thing in itself. Analog dials, walnut trim, the kind of craftsmanship that modern cars had stopped bothering with decades ago. And there it was. She'd seen it last night through the window of the flatbed, and again this morning at the garage. Just a flicker of something wrong that her brain had logged without her fully processing it. Now, up close, it was undeniable. The panel on the lower left of the dashboard, the section below the steering column, roughly the size of a large hardback book, had scratches around its edges. Not scratches from age or normal wear. Those existed elsewhere on the car and had their own character, soft, random, the natural biography of a loved machine. These were different. These were parallel, precise, the kind of marks left by a tool, something thin and flat, worked carefully around a seam. Someone had opened that panel, more than once. She leaned closer. The panel's alignment was slightly off, a gap on the left edge that was a millimeter wider than the right, small enough to miss entirely if you weren't looking for it. She looked at the seam running around the panel's perimeter and saw something else. The screws that should have been there weren't original factory screws. 2 of them were slightly newer, the threading just a shade sharper than the others. Replaced. Carefully, but not carefully enough. Emily sat back on her heels and stayed very still for a moment. Then she picked up her mop and went back to work. She found Tony in his study an hour later. He was on the phone, standing at the window with his back to the door. Emily waited in the doorway, which she'd knocked on twice. He held up one finger without turning. 1 minute, and finished his call. When he turned around, his expression said he had approximately 0 patience for interruptions. "The floor's done," Emily said, "but I noticed something in the garage, on the car." A pause. "Rosa can handle anything that needs. The dashboard panel on the driver's side has been opened and closed multiple times. The screws were replaced, not with factory parts, and there are tool marks around the seam that don't match the rest of the car's wear pattern." Tony looked at her. Not the brief, dismissive glance he'd been about to give her. A real look. "You're a housekeeper's daughter." "I have a degree in mechanical engineering," Emily said simply. "I'm between jobs." Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically, not warmly, just a slight recalibration. The look of a man who'd misjudged the weight of something and was quietly adjusting. "The panel could have been opened during one of the repairs. None of the mechanics touched that panel," she said. "I was there this morning. Vito worked the firewall, the fuse box, the ECU. That section of the dashboard was never opened. And the tool marks aren't fresh. They've been there a while, long enough to collect the same dust as the rest of the interior." Tony was quiet for a moment. "And the alignment?" she continued, steady but careful, not pushing, just presenting. "The left edge gap is wider than the right, by exactly the kind of margin you get when someone replaces the retaining mechanism with something that doesn't sit flush. Not sloppy work. Deliberate." Tony crossed the room slowly and stopped in front of her. "Show me," he said. Tony didn't call anyone. That was the first unusual thing. In 14 months of Ferrari problems, there had always been someone else in the room. Mechanics, crew members, Marco hovering near the door with his arms crossed. Tony DeLuca did not, as a rule, do things alone. Solitude was a luxury that men in his position couldn't afford, and he'd made peace with that a long time ago. But tonight, he sent everyone home early. The garage held just 2 people, Tony in a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and Emily, with a small leather tool roll she'd borrowed from the maintenance kit in the utility room. A portable work light sat on the roof of the car next to them, throwing everything into sharp, clean detail. Neither of them had spoken much on the walk over from the house. Tony crouched beside the open driver's door and looked at the panel Emily had described. He'd walked past this dashboard hundreds of times, running his hand along the leather, checking for dust, doing all the small rituals of a man preserving something precious. And he hadn't seen it. She had. In 3 minutes. From outside the car, through a window, at night. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. "Walk me through it again," he said. Emily knelt beside him, close enough to point without touching. "The seam here. See how the gap isn't uniform? Left side wider, right side tight. Original Ferrari panels from this era were fitted to fractions of a millimeter. That inconsistency doesn't come from age." She moved her finger along the lower edge. "And here, these 2 screws. See the threading? Slightly crisper than the others. Someone replaced them. Recently enough that the metal hasn't oxidized to match." Tony leaned in. He could see it now that she'd framed exactly where to look. It was subtle, impressively subtle. Whoever had done this had been careful, but not careful enough for Emily Carter. "The tool marks?" he asked. She produced a small flashlight from her jacket pocket and angled it low across the panel surface. In the raking light, the scratches appeared, faint, parallel lines running along the top and bottom edges of the panel. "Consistent with a flat trim removal tool," she said. "Used multiple times, same entry points. Whoever opened this knew what they were doing. They just didn't know someone would eventually look this closely." Tony stared at the marks for a long moment. Then he stood up. "Open it." Emily worked slowly, and without drama. She selected a trim tool from the leather roll, flat, thin, with a wrapped handle, and pressed it carefully into the seam at the top left corner of the panel. She ran it along the edge with steady, even pressure. A quiet series of clips released, one by one, like small, held breaths finally let go. The panel came free. Emily lifted it out and set it carefully on the passenger seat. Behind it was the original firewall cavity, a recessed space roughly the depth of a hand, running the width of the panel. In a stock car, it would hold nothing but wiring looms and insulation foam. This one held something else. Tucked flat against the back wall of the cavity, secured with a strip of black gaffer tape that had dried and hardened with age, was a sealed manila envelope. Thick. The tape had gone brittle at the edges. It had been here for a while. Long enough that the envelope had taken on the faint smell of the car itself. Oil and leather and time. Tony stared at it. Emily said nothing. She stepped back. He reached in and peeled the envelope free carefully, the old tape releasing with a dry, papery sound. He turned it over in his hands. No label. No name. Just a small piece of masking tape on the back with 4 numbers written in blue ink. 1971. The year of the car. Tony's jaw tightened. He knew that handwriting. He would have known it in the dark, in another language, on the other side of the world. It was Sal's. He stood completely still for a moment, long enough that Emily glanced at him sideways, reading the room with the care of someone who understood that certain silences needed to be respected. Then Tony opened the envelope. Inside were 3 folded sheets of paper and a smaller, sealed card. He unfolded the first sheet at the workbench, smoothing it flat under the portable light. It was dense with Sal's handwriting, the same rushed, slightly tilted script Tony remembered from birthday cards and grocery lists and the margins of racing programs at Monza. But this wasn't a grocery list. It was a ledger. Partial, handwritten, clearly copied from something else. Account numbers, routing codes, dollar figures that made Tony's eyes stop moving when he reached the total column. Millions. Moved in irregular increments across 18 months. The source codes meant nothing to Tony immediately, but the destination column had been highlighted in red pen. A single letter repeated. F. The second sheet was different, more rushed, written like notes rather than records. Fragments of sentences, abbreviations, question marks, scattered through the text like someone thinking out loud at speed. Tony read it twice, parsing Sal's shorthand. Transfers confirmed. Not external. Inside. F knows about Miami account. Only way. Chicago warehouse. Original record stored. Box 7. Don't trust the phones. And near the bottom, underlined twice and circled, if I don't finish this, the car knows everything. Tony read that line 3 times. The car knows everything. He set the page down and picked up the third sheet. This one was different again, a hand-drawn map. Simple, almost rough, but deliberate. A layout of locations across the United States: Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, and New York. Each city had a small notation beside it, a street address, or a name, or a number, connected by hand-drawn arrows that moved in sequence like a trail. A trail Sal had mapped. A trail Sal had never finished following. Tony set all 3 pages down on the workbench and stood over them, one hand pressed flat against the surface, the other hanging at his side in a fist so tight his knuckles were pale. Emily was reading the pages from where she stood, not touching anything, her eyes moving quietly across Sal's handwriting. She picked up the small sealed card, the last item from the envelope. "Should I?" she asked. Tony nodded. She opened it. Inside was a single index card, 5 words in Sal's handwriting. No explanation, no context. Frank knows. He was there. The garage was absolutely silent. Tony didn't move for a long time. His eyes were fixed on those 5 words with an expression that Emily had no frame of reference for. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even shock. It was something older and more complicated than any of those things. The expression of a man watching a world he thought he understood rearrange itself into something unrecognizable. Frank Doyle had been Tony's most trusted lieutenant for 11 years. He'd stood at Tony's shoulder at Sal's funeral, one hand on Tony's back, saying all the right things. Emily carefully set the card down beside the others. "Tony," she said quietly. He didn't respond. "Whoever tampered with this car's electrical system, they weren't trying to hide the compartment forever," she said. "The 11-minute failure, the looping fault, it was a lock. It was meant to stop anyone from running diagnostics long enough to find this panel." She paused. "Your brother built a safeguard into the car, something that made sure only the right person, looking in the right place, would ever get here." Tony finally looked up. His eyes were steady, but behind them something had fundamentally changed. "He knew," Tony said. It wasn't a question. "He knew," Emily confirmed softly. Tony looked back down at the 5 words on the index card. "Frank knows. He was there." "Then so do I," he said. Tony told no one where he was going. Not Marco, not his consigliere, Vincent, not the 6 men who usually flanked him whenever he moved between cities. He made 3 calls that morning, rerouting his schedule, canceling 2 meetings, creating the impression of a man who had simply decided to stay home for a few days. Then he took a car from the secondary garage, a gray Audi, unremarkable, unregistered to anything connected to his name, and drove to a private airfield in New Jersey. Emily was in the passenger seat. She hadn't asked to come. He hadn't exactly invited her. The night before, after the garage, after the envelope, after the silence that had stretched between them like something neither of them wanted to be the first to break, Tony had simply said, "The Chicago address. Can you read that map?" She'd said yes. That was apparently enough. They landed in Chicago at noon and drove south in a rental car, following the hand-drawn map that Emily had photographed on her phone and cross-referenced with a satellite view. Sal's notation for Chicago was a street address in the Pilsen neighborhood, a part of the city that had once been heavily industrial and still carried that history in its bones. Wide streets, old brick, the kind of neighborhood where a warehouse could sit quietly for years without attracting attention. The building was on a corner plot, half a block from the river. 3 stories, red brick gone dark with decades of grime, windows on the upper floors either boarded or broken. A faded sign above the loading bay read, "Central Cold Storage, estimated 1962, though it was clear nothing had been stored here for quite some time. Tony sat in the parked car across the street and looked at it. "This belonged to Sal?" Emily asked. "On paper it belonged to a holding company," Tony said, "one of about a dozen Sal managed. Real estate mostly, properties we kept for various reasons." He paused. "I never came here. Didn't need to." "Did Frank know about it?" Tony's jaw moved slightly. "Frank knew about most things." They sat for another moment. Then Tony got out of the car. The loading bay door wasn't locked, or rather it had been locked and someone had dealt with that at some point, leaving the hasp hanging open on a single bent screw. Tony noticed it, filed it away. He pushed the door open and they stepped into the darkness. The interior smelled like cold concrete and old metal. Weak gray light came through the boarded upper windows in thin strips. The ground floor was largely empty. A few abandoned pallets, some broken shelving, a rusted forklift that hadn't moved in years. Their footsteps echoed. "Sal's notes mentioned a box," Emily said quietly. "Box 7. The map had a small number next to the Chicago marker. Lower level." Tony found a staircase near the back wall, and they went down. The lower level was smaller, a series of storage rooms running off a central corridor, each numbered with painted stencils on the doors. The paint was old, but the numbers were clear enough. They passed rooms 1 through 6, each door standing open to empty darkness, until they reached the end of the corridor. Room 7 was locked. A proper lock, a heavy padlock, newer than anything else in the building, its steel still clean and unrusted. Tony looked at it for a moment, then looked at Emily. She reached into the jacket she'd been wearing since New York and produced a flat leather case about the size of a wallet. Tony watched as she selected 2 slim picks and worked the lock with a calm, focused efficiency that he decided not to comment on. The padlock opened in under 2 minutes. "Engineering degree," he said. "And a very boring gap year," she replied, pushing the door open. Room 7 wasn't empty. Against the far wall, beneath a workbench table, sat 3 archive boxes. Sturdy, sealed with tape, each one labeled in the same handwriting from the envelope. Tony crouched and pulled the nearest one out, slit the tape with his keys, and opened it. Inside were documents, printed records, dozens of them, paper-clipped into bundles and arranged in sequence. Bank statements, wire transfer confirmations, internal financial reports from what Tony immediately recognized as his own organization's accounts, the legitimate side, the construction companies and property holdings that served as the public face of everything he controlled. He picked up the first bundle and started reading. Emily took the second box. They worked in silence for 20 minutes, sitting on the concrete floor of a locked room in a building that no longer officially existed, going through a dead man's evidence. What emerged, piece by piece, was a picture that Tony absorbed with the steady, grim concentration of someone who had spent a lifetime being unsurprised by betrayal, and was nonetheless surprised. Over a period of roughly 2 years, significant sums had been systematically redirected from Tony's organization. Not stolen in obvious ways, no large single withdrawals, nothing that would trigger immediate suspicion. Instead, incremental amounts, moved through a chain of shell accounts with enough layers between them to take serious time to untangle. Whoever had constructed the system knew the organization's financial architecture intimately. Had to. There was no other way. Emily spread several documents across the floor side by side and studied them. "These transfers, look at the timing," she said. "They happen in clusters. 4 or 5 movements within a 2-week window, then nothing for 6 to 8 weeks, then another cluster." Tony looked where she was pointing. "Patterned." "Deliberately. Stay below the threshold of anything that gets reviewed, then go quiet long enough that any anomaly looks like normal variance." She tapped one of the documents. "This isn't opportunistic. Someone planned this from the beginning." Tony picked up a transfer confirmation near the bottom of the bundle. The destination account had been partially redacted. Sal's work, clearly, protecting his evidence, but the routing code was still visible. He recognized the prefix. It was a Miami institution. Private banking. He set the paper down carefully. "Miami," he said. Emily was already looking at the map on her phone. She nodded slowly. "The next marker on Sal's map. There's an address and a name." She looked up. "Does the name Hargrove mean anything to you?" Tony thought for a moment. "It's a law firm. We used them for property transactions years ago. Stopped using them." He paused. "Sal recommended we stop using them, about 2.5 years ago." Emily held his gaze steadily. 2.5 years ago is exactly when these transfer clusters begin. The room settled into silence. Tony looked down at the archive boxes. Sal's months of careful, secret work, hidden in a locked room in a building nobody visited. He thought about his brother going quiet in the last year of his life. The paranoia Tony had noticed and dismissed as stress. The way Sal had started keeping his own schedule, making his own moves, not running things past Tony the way he always had. He hadn't been pulling away. He'd been protecting Tony from what he knew, keeping him clean, keeping him separate, while he quietly built a case that could bring the whole thing down. And then someone had found out. Tony closed the archive box and stood up. "Take photographs of everything," he said. "Every page." Emily was already doing it. He walked to the doorway of room 7 and stood there while she worked, looking back down the empty corridor. The building above them was silent. The city outside went about its business. Somewhere out there, Frank Doyle was going about his day too. Meetings, phone calls, the normal machinery of loyalty and deception, completely unaware that a dead man's archive box had just been opened in a basement in Pilsen. Tony thought about the last time he'd seen Frank, 3 days ago, standing in his office, telling Tony that the Ferrari problem was probably just age. "Some cars just fight you, boss. It happens." Tony had nodded and believed him. he would not be nodding again. Memory is a strange thing for men like Tony DeLuca. Most people collect their past like photographs, images they can take out, look at, put away. For Tony, memory worked differently. It lived in his body, not his mind. In the tightness of his shoulders when a conversation shifted tone. In the way his eyes moved to exits before he'd consciously decided to. Years of surviving in a world where reading people and situations correctly was the difference between going home and not going home at all. It wired you in ways that couldn't be unwired. Which was why, sitting in a rental car outside a glass-fronted law office on Brickell Avenue in Miami, watching the city's afternoon light turn everything gold and indifferent, Tony finally allowed himself to do something he'd been avoiding for 2 years. He thought about Sal. Honestly, without the protective layer of grief that usually stood between him and the memories. It had started. He could see it now, with the terrible clarity of hindsight, about 3 years ago. Sal had always been the more social of the two of them, easier with people, quicker to laugh, the kind of man who remembered everyone's wife's name and their kids' birthdays without writing them down. Where Tony commanded rooms through stillness and reputation, Sal worked them through warmth. Different tools, same result. But somewhere around 3 years ago, the warmth had started running on something lower. Tony had noticed it at a dinner in October, Sal arriving late, distracted, eating almost nothing. Tony had asked if he was all right. Sal had smiled and said something about not sleeping well, stress with a property deal. Tony had accepted that. Business was complicated. People had bad months. Then there was Christmas. Sal had been present in body and absent in everything else. Eyes moving to his phone, excusing himself twice to take calls, coming back to the table each time a degree quieter than before. Tony had put a hand on his brother's shoulder at one point and felt the tension in it like a wound spring. "You'd tell me if something was wrong," Tony had said. Not quite a question. "Of course," Sal had said, looking him directly in the eye, meaning it and not meaning it simultaneously, in the way only family can. Tony had let it go. He wished, with a weight that had no bottom to it, that he hadn't. Hargrove and Associates occupied the 14th floor of a building that spoke quietly but confidently about money. The firm still existed, still operational, still handling high-end property and corporate transactions, though under different senior management since the founding partner, Edward Hargrove, had retired 18 months ago. Retired suddenly, Emily had noted while researching on the flight down. No announcement, no farewell function. There 1 month, gone the next. They didn't go upstairs. Instead, following the second piece of Sal's map, a notation that read HG/basement records/ask for D, they found a side entrance that led to a document storage facility in the building's lower levels, a private archive service used by several of the building's firms. The name D turned out to be Diane, a quiet woman in her 60s who managed the archive, who had apparently been expecting someone to come eventually, and who looked at Tony with the careful recognition of a person who has been holding something for a long time and is relieved to finally pass it on. "Mr. Salvatore said a family member would come," she said. "He said to give them everything in his file." She handed Tony a sealed cardboard folder. Inside were bank records, real ones, not copies, original statements from the Miami private account that Sal had traced the transfers to, printed on headed paper, signed by the account manager. Absolutely irrefutable. The account holder's name had been buried under 3 layers of corporate ownership, but Sal had already done the excavation. Handwritten on the inside cover of the folder, in red ink, was a clean chain of ownership. Shell company to shell company to shell company, each one dissolving into the next like Russian dolls, until the final name at the end of the chain, Frank Doyle. Not directly. Of course not. There was a numbered holding company in between, registered in Delaware, connected to Frank through a property he'd purchased 11 years ago under a different name. The kind of connection that would take forensic accountants months to surface. Sal had surfaced it in secret, alone, over 2 years. Tony sat in the car outside the building and held the folder in his lap and said nothing for a long time.
Emily didn't fill the silence. She was learning when not to. It was on the drive back to the hotel that Emily said something Tony hadn't expected. "The Ferrari's electrical fault," she said, eyes on the road. "I've been thinking about the 11-minute pattern since Brooklyn." Tony glanced at her. 11 minutes is the approximate run time before the car's secondary management system runs a background diagnostic cycle. It's a quirk of this generation of Ferrari's ignition architecture. During that diagnostic window, the primary ECU briefly queries all connected systems, including the dashboard panel cluster. She paused. If someone introduced a specific fault into the wiring behind that panel, subtle enough not to trigger immediately, but timed to activate during that diagnostic window, the car would kill power to itself every time the diagnostic ran, as a protection. Tony was quiet. "It took real knowledge of this specific car to engineer that," Emily continued. "Not a general mechanic, someone who studied this model, someone who knew exactly how its electrical system behaved." She looked at him briefly. "Your brother did that deliberately. The car would never pass a diagnostic long enough for anyone to declare it fully fixed and sell it or store it away somewhere. It would keep failing. It would stay in your hands, in garages, near people, until someone looked in the right place." Tony processed this slowly. "He sabotaged it to keep it close," he said. "He sabotaged it to keep the evidence safe," Emily corrected gently. "The car was the only thing he knew you'd never give up on." Tony turned to look out the passenger window at Miami rolling past, the palms, the glass, the easy, beautiful surface of a city that hid its complications well. Sal had known him better than anyone alive, had known that Tony would spend $1 million before he'd abandon his brother's car, had known that Tony's stubbornness, the same stubbornness that had made him formidable and sometimes impossible, would eventually, inevitably, lead someone to look closely enough. He'd built a puzzle and left it inside the one thing Tony would never stop trying to fix. And for 2 years, Frank Doyle, who also knew Tony, who had sat across from him at countless tables and watched him pour money into those repairs, had said nothing, had watched, had perhaps even quietly encouraged the parade of mechanics, knowing the real problem could never be found by someone who didn't know where to look. The cruelty of it settled on Tony like something physical. "He sat at my brother's funeral," Tony said. His voice was completely level, the dangerous kind of level. Emily said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. "He put his hand on my back." A pause. "He told me Sal would have wanted me to let myself grieve." The car moved through Miami traffic, normal, ordinary Miami traffic, horns and music and the indifferent machinery of a city that didn't know and wouldn't care. "Los Angeles," Tony said finally. "The third marker." Emily nodded. "There's a name this time. No address, just a name and a phone number." She showed him the photograph of Sal's map on her phone. Tony looked at the name. His eyes stayed on it for a long moment. "I know him," he said quietly. "He worked with Sal for years, left the organization about 18 months ago. I was told he retired." He handed the phone back. "I'm going to guess," Tony said, "that he didn't retire." The man's name was Ray Costa. In another life, a life that had ended abruptly and without ceremony 18 months ago, Ray had been one of Sal DeLuca's most reliable operators. Not violent, not flashy, the kind of man organizations needed but rarely celebrated. Smart, discreet, capable of making complicated arrangements look simple. He'd handled logistics, primarily, movement of money, movement of people, the quiet management of things that couldn't be managed loudly. Tony had always liked him, in the distracted way he liked people who did their jobs without requiring attention. When Ray had supposedly retired, Tony had signed off on a generous severance, a number that reflected years of loyal service, and moved on. There had been no reason to think twice about it. There was always a reason.
Tony understood that now. Ray Costa was living in a rented house in Silver Lake under a name that wasn't his, a detail Emily surfaced within 6 hours of landing in Los Angeles, cross-referencing the phone number from Sal's map against a property rental database she accessed through means Tony decided not to ask about directly. The house was modest and deliberately anonymous. No car in the driveway, curtains drawn in the middle of the afternoon, the particular blankness of a property inhabited by someone trying very hard not to be noticed. Tony knocked on the door alone. He'd left Emily in the rental car 2 blocks away, despite her measured objection. This part wasn't for her. Some conversations required a specific kind of atmosphere, the kind that 2 people from the same world could generate without explanation, and that an outsider's presence would only complicate. The door opened on the 3rd knock. Ray Costa had aged considerably in 18 months. He'd always been lean, but now he was thin in the way people get when worry becomes their primary occupation. His eyes, quick and sharp once, the eyes of a man perpetually processing, went through several distinct phases in the 2 seconds after he registered who was standing on his doorstep. Recognition, fear, calculation, resignation. All in 2 seconds. "Tony," he said.
"Ray?"
Tony replied pleasantly. "Going to invite me in?" The living room held almost no furniture. A couch, a folding table, a laptop that Ray closed carefully as Tony entered. The walls were bare. There were 2 boxes near the hallway, half-packed. Ray had been preparing to move again. Tony sat down on the couch with the easy authority of a man sitting in his own space, which had always been one of his particular skills. He looked at Ray standing in the middle of the room and said nothing, just waited. Silences were tools in Tony's experience, sharp ones. Ray lasted 40 seconds. "How did you find me?" "Does it matter?" "I suppose not." Ray sat down heavily on the folding chair across from him. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for a long time and was calculating whether putting it down might actually be worth what came after. "I've been waiting for this. Wondered what shape it would take." "What shape did you expect?" "Not you sitting on my couch asking polite questions." He paused. "That's actually worse, if I'm honest." "Good instinct." Tony leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I'm going to tell you what I know, and then you're going to tell me what you know. And the only thing that matters, the only thing that determines how this conversation ends, is whether what you tell me is true." Ray looked at him for a long moment, then he nodded. It came out in pieces, the way confessions always do, not in one clean narrative but in fragments, assembled in real time, each piece pulling the next one forward. Ray had known about the financial transfers for almost 3 years. He hadn't discovered them himself. Sal had brought him in, carefully, needing someone inside the organization who could verify certain transactions without raising flags. Ray had been that person. He'd confirmed what Sal suspected. Money was moving, regularly and deliberately, from Tony's legitimate holdings into a chain of accounts that eventually, after considerable architecture, landed somewhere it had no business being. "Sal tracked it to Frank," Ray said. "Took him the better part of a year. Frank had built it carefully. Not from nothing, from scratch, starting years before Sal got suspicious. He'd been routing small amounts through the property arm since almost the beginning. Nothing large enough to notice individually. Collectively, it was a fortune," Tony said. "Collectively, it was generational money," Ray said. "And it wasn't just the transfers." Tony's eyes sharpened slightly. "Frank wasn't just taking money," Ray continued, his voice dropping lower. "He was building something, his own structure, separate from yours, parallel almost. A network, contacts, accounts, arrangements. The money was the foundation. He was constructing an exit, or a replacement. I was never entirely sure which." Tony absorbed this without visible reaction. "And Sal found out how much?" "Sal found out almost everything. That was the problem." Ray rubbed his face with both hands. He got too close, too fast toward the end. Started moving toward the Los Angeles connection. There was a man here Frank was funneling money through, a financial broker. Sal had his name, had documentation. He stopped. And then Sal died, Tony said quietly. Ray nodded. He didn't look up. The night of the restaurant. It wasn't random. It was arranged. I didn't know beforehand, Tony. I want to be clear about that. I found out after. Frank told me, not as a confession, as a warning. He told me what he'd done and what he was capable of. And then he told me that if I ever... He stopped again. He threatened you, Tony said. He made it very clear what loyalty to him looked like, and what disloyalty cost. Ray's voice was steady, but his hands, clasped between his knees, were not. I took the severance and I left. I've been moving every few months since. I thought if I was small enough and quiet enough, you could wait it out, Tony said. Ray nodded. But you kept the evidence, Tony said. Ray looked up, surprised. Sal knew you, Tony continued. He wouldn't have brought you in without making sure there was a fail-safe, something you held, something that meant you couldn't just walk away clean even if you wanted to. He paused. Because Sal didn't trust clean, Ray. He trusted complicated. He knew complicated people kept their insurance. A long silence. Then Ray stood up, went to one of the half-packed boxes in the hallway, and removed a false bottom Tony would never have noticed without knowing to look. Beneath it was a sealed envelope, heavier than the one in the Ferrari, more documents, more records. He brought it back and placed it on the couch beside Tony. There's something else, Ray said, sitting down again. His expression had changed, something resolving in it, the relief of a man finally setting down weight he'd carried alone for too long. The final piece of evidence, the thing that connects Frank directly and without question. Sal didn't leave it in Chicago or Miami or with me. He paused. Tony looked at him. He left it in the car. Tony went very still. Sal told me the night before he died, Ray said. He said if anything happened to him, everything would lead back to the car eventually. He said he'd hidden one last thing, something that couldn't be dismissed or explained away, something even Frank couldn't talk himself out of. Ray held Tony's gaze. He said the car would keep it safe until the right person was ready to find it. Tony thought about Emily in the garage, crouched in the lamplight, working panel clips with steady hands, finding what 14 months and hundreds of thousands of dollars had failed to find. The right person. The electrical fault, Tony said slowly. Emily said there was one last system she hadn't fully traced, behind the instrument cluster. She said it didn't fit the pattern of the rest of the sabotage. Because it isn't sabotage, Ray said. It's a lock. One more lock. And Sal told me only one thing about what's behind it. Tony waited. He said it was enough to end Frank Doyle for good. The drive back to Silver Lake took 11 minutes. Tony sat in the passenger seat and stared through the windscreen at the Los Angeles afternoon, the wide, flat light, the endless geography of a city that kept its distances. Emily drove without speaking, reading his silence correctly. But after a few blocks, Tony looked at her. "We need to go back to the car," he said. Emily didn't ask why. She already knew from his face. "New York," she said. "New York," he confirmed. Outside, L.A. went about its enormous, indifferent business. Behind them, in a house in Silver Lake, Ray Costa packed his 2 boxes and wondered if, for the first time in 18 months, he might be able to stop moving. The estate was quiet when they returned. Not the ordinary quiet of a house settling into evening, something more deliberate than that. Tony had kept the staff minimal since leaving for Chicago, rotating the men on gate duty so no single person could map his movements. Rosa had been given a paid week at a hotel in Midtown, which she'd accepted with the dignified confusion of a woman who had never been given a paid week anywhere. Emily had called her mother from the road and said only that everything was fine and she'd explain later. She wasn't sure yet how much of that was true. The Ferrari sat where they'd left it, undisturbed in the private garage. The dashboard panel was still removed, resting against the passenger seat. The hidden compartment open and empty now, its secrets already extracted, photographed, carried halfway across the country and back. But there was one more thing. Emily walked directly to the driver's side, crouched, and looked into the open cavity behind the panel. She'd been thinking about this for 3 days, on planes, in hotel rooms, lying awake at 2 a.m. while Tony sat in the next room doing whatever Tony did in the dark when the walls of his composure came down slightly. She'd been running the Ferrari's electrical architecture through her head in the background of every conversation, every meal, every quiet mile of road. The 11-minute fault had been Sal's primary lock, elegant, specific, almost impossible to diagnose because it mimicked genuine electrical failure perfectly. But Ray's words had confirmed what Emily had already half suspected. There was a second mechanism, separate from the first, not connected to the ignition or the ECU or any of the systems Vito and his men had spent months chasing, connected to something else entirely. She spent the first hour doing nothing but looking. Tony stood near the garage workbench, jacket off, watching her work with the focused patience of a man who had learned, over the past 2 weeks, that rushing Emily Carter produced nothing useful. He'd offered to help twice. She'd declined twice, politely but definitively, and he'd accepted that the way he accepted most things that were simply true, without drama. Emily moved through the car's interior systematically, not with tools yet, just eyes and a flashlight, working from what she knew about this model's construction. The 1971 Daytona had a complex instrument cluster by the standards of its era, multiple gauges, a separate warning light panel, wiring that ran behind the dash in 3 distinct looms. She'd studied the factory schematics on her phone during the flight back, cross-referencing them against what she'd already seen inside the car. The secondary fault, Sal's second lock, wasn't in the main cavity. She was certain of that. The main cavity had been designed for access. Whatever Sal had hidden last was meant to be found only after everything else, a final door that only opened when you already had the map. She lay on her back on the driver's seat and looked up into the underside of the instrument cluster with the flashlight. And there it was. It was almost invisible, which was the point. A secondary wiring loom, running parallel to the original factory loom but thinner, its insulation color matched to the surrounding wiring with careful precision. It branched off from the main harness at a junction point that would look, to any reasonable mechanic, like a standard factory connector. Followed it long enough, though, and it terminated not at any instrument or warning system, but at a small, custom-fabricated module no larger than a deck of cards, secured with 2 small bolts to the inside face of the dashboard cavity wall. The module had a single indicator, a tiny LED, currently dark, and on its face, a keyway. Not an electrical keyway, a physical one, a small brass lock, the kind that might secure a diary or a jewelry box. Modest, almost incongruous in this context. Completely invisible unless you were lying on your back looking up into the cavity with a flashlight at exactly the right angle. Emily sat up slowly. "Tony." He was beside the car in 4 steps. She showed him with the flashlight. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "A key," he said finally. "A specific key. Probably custom cut." Emily sat up straight. "Did Sal carry keys you didn't recognize? On his key ring or separately?" Tony was already moving. He left the garage without a word and returned 4 minutes later holding a small Ziploc bag, the kind used for personal effects. Inside were items Emily recognized as the kind of thing kept after a person dies. A watch, a folded receipt, a religious medal on a broken chain, and a key. Small, brass, slightly worn, no identifying marks. Tony held it up in the light. His expression was completely controlled, the mask he wore when something was costing him more than he intended to show. "From the hospital," he said. "They gave me his things. I kept everything." A pause. "I never knew what this key was for." Emily took it carefully. It fit. The module's internal mechanism was simple, a circuit that, when locked, created a specific resistance in the secondary loom, producing the anomalous fault code that had confused every mechanic for 14 months. Unlock it, and the circuit completed differently. Not an electrical fix, a deliberate resolution. The car hadn't needed a replacement part or a new system. It had needed its key. When Emily turned it, the tiny LED on the module face shifted from dark to a steady green. Beneath the module, secured to the same mounting bracket, was a flat metal container, the size of a large envelope, perhaps 3 centimeters deep, sealed with a secondary latch that the key also operated. Emily unlatched it and passed it to Tony. He opened it. Inside, protected by a layer of foam, were 3 items. The first was a USB drive, small, black, labeled in Sal's handwriting with a single word: Doyle. The second was a printed photograph. Tony looked at it and went very still. The image showed 2 men at what appeared to be a restaurant table. One was a face Tony didn't know, middle-aged, expensive suit. The other was Frank Doyle. Between them on the table, clearly visible, was a document with a recognizable letterhead, one of Tony's own holding companies. The date stamp in the photograph's corner was 3 weeks before Sal died. The third item was a single sheet of paper, a signed statement, notarized, in Sal's name, dated the same week as the photograph. It outlined, in precise legal language, everything Sal had discovered: the financial transfers, the parallel structure Frank had been building, the identity of the financial broker in Los Angeles. And at the bottom, in a section titled Additional Knowledge, a single declarative sentence that made the room feel smaller. On the evening of March 4th, I personally witnessed Frank Doyle confirm arrangements for the removal of a party described only as the brother, with an individual I have identified as Marcus Webb, known associate of the Caruso family. The brother was how people in their world sometimes referred to Sal, the boss's brother, a shorthand used in rooms where direct names were avoided. Tony read the statement twice. Then he set it down on the workbench and pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed. Emily stood quietly near the car, giving him the space the moment required. She understood, with the particular clarity she'd developed over the past 2 weeks of watching this man hold himself together, that what he was feeling right now was not something that needed commentary. His brother had known he was going to die, had known it, and instead of running, instead of coming to Tony and upending everything and asking for protection, had spent his final days making sure the evidence was complete, making sure the truth would outlast him, making sure Tony would eventually have everything he needed to understand and to act. The last gift of someone who knew Tony better than Tony knew himself. "He finished it," Tony said. His voice was barely above a quiet. Emily nodded. "He finished it, and he put it somewhere he knew I'd never stop looking." He picked up the USB drive and held it between his fingers. 2 years of work. On a drive the size of my thumbnail. Inside a car I couldn't fix. He set it down carefully, looked at the photograph, at Frank Doyle's face, the familiar face, the trusted face, the face that had sat across from him at 100 tables. Something settled in Tony's expression then. Not peace, not quite, but a kind of clarity, the look of a man who has been searching for something for a very long time and has finally found it, and now understands exactly what comes next. "Make copies of everything," he said. "All of it. 3 separate sets. One stays here, one goes somewhere Frank would never think to look." He picked up his jacket from the workbench. "And one I carry myself." He walked to the garage door and paused. "I need to make a call," he said. "Then we need to talk about tomorrow night." Emily looked at him. "Frank." "Frank," Tony confirmed. He walked out into the dark, quiet grounds of the estate, and the garage light hummed behind him, and the Ferrari finally, for the first time in 14 months, sat in a room without the weight of an unsolved question pressing down on it. The answer had been found. Now came what followed. Tony made the call at midnight. Frank Doyle answered on the second ring, the way he always did, present, reliable, the performance of a loyal man so well rehearsed that Tony had never once thought to question the actor behind it. "Boss, everything all right?" "Need to see you tomorrow night," Tony said. His voice carried nothing unusual, the same flat authority of 100 previous calls. "Red Hook Dockyard, the old Marchetti property, 11 o'clock. A brief pause, brief enough that only someone listening for it would catch it. "Of course. Just us?" "Just us," Tony said. "There's something I need to handle quietly." Another pause. Then, "I'll be there." Tony ended the call and stood in the dark for a long time. The Marchetti dockyard had been out of operation for 8 years, a sprawling expanse of cracked concrete, rusted cranes, and warehouse shells along the waterfront in Red Hook, owned through 3 layers of corporate paper by an entity Tony controlled, the kind of property that served no commercial purpose but several other kinds. Frank would know it. He'd been to meetings here before. Nothing about the location would alarm him, which was precisely why Tony had chosen it. Tony arrived at 10:30 with Marco and 2 other men he trusted with specific and granular certainty. Not blind trust. Tony had learned definitively and permanently what blind trust cost, but tested trust, the kind built through years of small moments rather than declared loyalty. He placed Marco near the east entrance and the other 2 at positions that covered the perimeter. Then he walked to the center of the main warehouse floor and waited. Emily was not there. He'd been clear about that the night before, clear in a way that hadn't invited discussion. This was not her world. She had given him the truth. What he did with it was his. She had looked at him for a long moment and then nodded. Not because she was dismissed, because she understood the distinction. Frank arrived at 11:05. He came alone, as instructed, or appeared to. Tony had Marco run a quiet perimeter check. Clean. Frank had followed the rules of the meeting, which said something. He was confident. He believed he still had the upper hand, or believed that whatever Tony wanted to discuss was operational, manageable, something that could be navigated with the practiced ease of 11 years of successful deception. His footsteps echoed across the warehouse floor. Tony stood in the center, hands loose at his sides, in the pool of light thrown by a single hanging work lamp that Marco had rigged earlier. The rest of the warehouse was in darkness. Frank stepped into the light. He was well dressed, as always, good coat, careful grooming, the face of a dependable man, the face Tony had trusted completely and without question for over a decade. "Boss?" he said, with the easy familiarity of their relationship. Then he read the room, Tony's stillness, the particular quality of the silence, the absence of the usual easy atmosphere between them. Frank was smart. It took him approximately 4 seconds. "Something's wrong." "Sit down, Frank." A chair had been placed in the light. Frank looked at it, looked at Tony, and sat. The calculation was already running behind his eyes. Tony could see it now, with the terrible new clarity of someone whose vision had been corrected. Every micro-movement of Frank's expression was legible in a way it had never been before. Because before, Tony hadn't been looking for the seams. Now he saw nothing but seams. Tony reached into his jacket and placed 3 items on the empty crate between them, one at a time. The photograph first, Frank and the unknown man, Tony's letterhead visible between them on the table. Then the printed summary of the financial transfers, terminating at the Delaware holding company registered in Frank's name. Then the notarized statement. Sal's words, Sal's signature, the final sentence underlined. Frank looked at the 3 items. His face went through a process, not the dramatic collapse of a man caught off guard, but something more controlled. A series of small adjustments, recalibrations, the expression of someone running contingencies in real time. He looked up at Tony. "Where did you get these?" "From my brother," Tony said. Frank was quiet. Then, carefully, Sal is gone, Tony. He planned for that. Another silence. Frank looked back at the documents. His composure was remarkable. Tony could acknowledge that even now, even here. 11 years of deception required a particular kind of discipline, and Frank had it. But there was something underneath the composure, something tightening, a pressure building behind the controlled surface. You want me to explain this? Frank said. No, Tony said. I want you to confirm it. There's a difference. Frank looked up again.
I don't need the explanation, Tony continued. I have the explanation. I have the transfers, the accounts, the timeline, the photograph, and a signed legal statement that places you in a conversation arranging my brother's death. His voice was completely level, not cold, not heated, just precise, the way you speak when emotion is not the point. I have 2 years of Sal's work on a USB drive that will take forensic accountants approximately 3 days to fully map. He paused. I'm not asking you to explain. I'm giving you the opportunity to confirm, because Sal spent 2 years building this case for me, and I think he deserves to have it spoken out loud in a room where it matters. Frank held his gaze for a long moment. Then something in him seemed to make a decision, a settling, almost, the release of a man who has been holding a shape for so long that the relief of dropping it outweighs everything else. You were never supposed to find it, he said. His voice was different now, quieter, something genuine moving through it for the first time. I had people watch those garages for months. I kept steering you toward mechanics who'd never look in the right places. I told you the car was just old. He paused. It should have worked. It did work, Tony said. For 14 months. Who found it? Tony said nothing. Frank almost smiled, not warmly, ruefully. The expression of a man who could still appreciate a well-constructed problem, even as it dismantled him. Not one of your crew. Someone outside. He nodded slowly. Sal always said your weakness was trusting the people closest to you too much, and the people at the edges not enough. The words landed like something physical, because they were true, because they were exactly the kind of thing Sal would have said, and the exact lesson that a dead man had, apparently, found a way to teach from the other side. Tony looked at Frank for a long time. Tell me why, he said, and for the first time, something moved through his voice that wasn't pure control. Not the money. Not the mechanics of it. Why? Frank was quiet. Then, because I built half of what you have. The structures, the relationships, the architecture of everything that runs under your name. And I was always in the room, never at the table. He said it without particular bitterness, more like a man reading a fact from a ledger. I waited. I asked once. You told me loyalty was its own reward. A pause. I stopped believing that. Tony absorbed this. So you took, he said. I built, Frank said sharply. Then, after a moment, quieter, and then I did something I can't undo. He looked down at Sal's notarized statement on the crate between them. Something moved across his face that wasn't composure, or calculation, or the disciplined surface he'd maintained for 11 years. Something that looked, briefly and unmistakably, like the weight of what he'd actually done settling on him fully for perhaps the first time. He was going to destroy everything, Frank said. He was going to give me the truth, Tony said. Silence. Tony reached into his jacket again, but not for a weapon. He produced his phone and placed it on the crate beside the documents. A recording application was running, had been running since Frank sat down. I have everything I need, Tony said. The financial records will go to federal authorities through a channel that can't be traced back to this organization. The photograph and statement go to the DA's office. The USB drive goes to a forensic accountant whose findings will be independently verified. He paused. You won't be able to talk your way out of any of it, Frank. Not with lawyers, not with our world. Both doors are closed. Frank looked at the phone, then at Tony. I thought you'd pull the trigger,
he said. I know you did, Tony replied. That's who I was 2 weeks ago. He stood up. Marco appeared from the darkness at the edge of the warehouse, and with him 2 men Tony had arranged. Not crew members, professionals of a different kind, the kind with badges. Frank looked at them, looked back at Tony. Your brother would be satisfied, he said. He meant it as something, Tony wasn't entirely sure what. Tony picked up the documents and the phone from the crate. My brother deserved better than satisfaction, he said. He deserved justice. There's a difference. He walked toward the warehouse door. Behind him, Frank Doyle was taken into custody, quietly, without theater, the way the real endings of things usually happen, not with noise and fire, but with paperwork and the sound of handcuffs clicking closed in an empty building by the waterfront. Tony walked outside into the cold, Red Hook night. He stood at the water's edge and looked out at the harbor, the lights on the far shore, the dark water moving between them, the ordinary, indifferent world carrying on around the edges of something that had cost him enormously and taken 2 years of his brother's life to construct. He thought about Sal. Not the grief this time, not the 14 months of loss and guilt and unanswered questions. Just Sal. The man himself, the laugh, the cheap pine air freshener, the way he always ordered too much food and then gave half of it away to whoever was nearby. He'd been smarter than Tony had known, more patient, more courageous. The harbor lights blurred slightly. Tony let them. The morning came in quietly. No wind, a sky the color of pale ash, the kind that couldn't decide between cloud and light and had settled on both. The cemetery was largely empty at this hour, a groundskeeper moving distantly between headstones, a woman with flowers near the eastern path. Nobody else. The particular stillness of a place that exists outside the normal rhythm of the living city surrounding it. Tony had been here twice since Sal's funeral. Both times he hadn't been able to stay longer than a few minutes. He'd stood at the grave, said nothing, left. Not because he didn't want to be there, because being there required something he hadn't been able to locate inside himself. Something that only arrives when the weight you're carrying has been put down long enough for you to stand straight again. He stood straight now. Sal's headstone was simple. Tony had chosen it himself, over the objections of various people who felt a DeLuca should have something grander. A clean rectangle of dark granite, a name, dates, and 3 words beneath them. Beloved brother, always. Tony stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. Then he crouched down and set something against the base of the stone. The small pine air freshener from the Ferrari, still faintly fragrant. He'd found it in the glove box when Emily had been working, a week ago now, and he'd pocketed it without saying anything to anyone. He straightened up. I found it, he said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. The morning absorbed it quietly. Took me 14 months and one person I should have paid more attention to a long time ago. He paused. That's probably fair, given how long it took me to pay attention to most things. A breath. Frank is done. Federally. It'll move slowly, it always does, but it'll move. The financial people say 18 months before sentencing, maybe less if they decide to deal. It doesn't matter. He's done. A bird moved somewhere in the trees above him. I know you didn't want me to handle it the other way, Tony continued. That's why you built it the way you did. The whole trail, everything documented, signed, notarized. You weren't just collecting evidence. You were making sure I couldn't disappear it the way I disappear everything. You made it too clean, too legal, too tied to people outside my world. He shook his head slowly. That was deliberate, wasn't it? Not a question. You always were smarter than me, Tony said. I told people you were the easier one, the warm one. I told myself that for years. He was quiet for a moment. I think I was just trying to make myself feel like the useful one. The groundskeeper moved further away. The woman with flowers was gone. I'm sorry it took so long, Tony said. I'm sorry I missed it. All the signs, the pulling back, the paranoia, the way you stopped running things past me. I thought you were stressed. I thought it was something I'd done." He stopped. I didn't think to look at who was standing next to me at the time. He looked at the headstone for a long moment. "You left me a way forward," he said. "I don't know if I deserve it, but I'm going to try to be worth what it cost you." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small photograph, the two of them at a race in Monza years ago, both younger and more careless. Sal with his arm around Tony's shoulder and his head thrown back laughing. Tony had found it in the same box as the hospital effects. He tucked it carefully against the base of the stone, beside the air freshener. "The car runs," he said. "Finally." Emily was waiting by the cemetery gate when he came back down the path. She was in a coat he hadn't seen before, dark blue, collar turned up against the morning air. She'd been standing quietly, not on her phone, not doing anything in particular, just present, the way she'd been present through all of this, without inserting herself, without asking for acknowledgement, without requiring anything from the situation except the chance to be useful. He'd noticed that quality in her from the beginning, he realized, even on the steps of the penthouse that first night, standing half behind her mother, deciding whether to step into the light or not. She'd always been deciding how much of herself to offer without being asked. Tony stopped beside her. "How is he?" she asked. It took him a moment to understand she meant Sal, the grave, the visit. He looked at her sideways. "Probably irritated it took this long," he said. Emily almost smiled. "Sounds right." They walked together toward the car. Tony had been thinking, for the past week, about what came next. Not operationally. The legal machinery was in motion now, in the hands of people who operated in courtrooms rather than dockyards. That was its own process. He meant something more personal. The question of who he was on the other side of this. What he did with the thing Sal had essentially handed him. A choice. He'd spent enough time thinking about it that it had become, for the first time in his adult life, something close to a conclusion. He stopped walking before they reached the car. "I need to ask you something," he said. Emily turned. "The engineering degree," Tony said. "What was the job you were between?" She looked at him, mildly guarded. "I was consulting for a firm that assessed classic vehicle authentications. Insurance work, mostly. The company folded." "Before that?" 2 years with an aerospace manufacturer, structural diagnostics. Tony nodded slowly. "I have 17 properties in need of serious structural assessment. Legitimate properties, Emily, not the other kind. The construction side of the business. It's large, and it's been managed by people I trusted on instinct for too long." He paused. "I need someone who looks at things the way you look at things, who notices the gap on the left edge that doesn't match the right, who asks the question everyone else is too comfortable to ask." Emily studied him. "That's a job offer." "It's a significant one." "For your organization." "For the legitimate half of it," Tony said, "which I intend to make the whole of it. Not immediately. These things don't move immediately. But that's the direction." He held her gaze. "Sal's evidence gave me leverage I haven't had before. I intend to use it to get out plainly, over time, in a way that leaves the people who depend on the legitimate operations standing." He paused. "I could use someone structurally sound in the room." Emily was quiet for a moment. She looked back toward the cemetery, at the tree line, at the pale morning sky above it. "My mother," she said. "Will have a home here as long as she wants one," Tony said immediately, "with a salary that reflects what she's actually worth, which is considerably more than she's been paid." He paused. "That's not conditional. That's regardless of your answer." Emily looked at him. "You could have led with that," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted you to know the offer was for you." A beat of silence between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that exists between two people who have been through something real together and don't need to fill every moment of it. "I'll think about it," Emily said. Tony nodded. That was enough. They drove back to the estate in the kind of quiet that had become comfortable over 2 weeks of shared, strange days. The city moved around them, Manhattan on a gray morning, ordinary and enormous, indifferent to the small private weight being carried through it in a gray car on a regular road. The Ferrari was parked in the garage. Tony had a technician come out the previous afternoon, a different one entirely, someone who knew nothing of the previous 14 months and had simply been given the car and the electrical schematics and the specific note. Secondary loom, module behind instrument cluster, key-operated circuit, resolve from there. It had taken the technician 6 hours. The car started the first time and ran. Tony went into the garage alone now, sent the man at the door away, and stood in the quiet space with the Ferrari under the lights. He ran his hand along the roofline, the same way he'd done 100 times before, but without the particular quality of grief and futility that had always been underneath it. He opened the driver's door and sat inside. The leather was cool. The dials in the dark were just dials. The dashboard panel was back in place, refitted, perfectly aligned, gap uniform on both sides. The hidden compartment was empty now, its contents photographed and documented and distributed across 3 secure locations, its key on Tony's key ring where it would stay. He put his hand on the gear shift, not to drive, just to sit with it. Sal had built a puzzle inside the one thing Tony loved without complication, had trusted that love completely, and had been right to. And somewhere in the understanding of that, of a brother who knew him well enough to hide truth inside a car and believe it would eventually be found, something in Tony that had been locked as tightly as any hidden compartment had finally, quietly, come open. He sat in the Ferrari for a while, then he got out, turned off the garage light, and walked back into the house. Behind him, in the dark, the car that had spent 14 months failing beautifully sat finally, completely, wholly at rest. The mystery was finished. The truth had been delivered. And Anthony DeLuca walked through his own front door, a different man than he had been when he walked out of it. Not lighter, exactly, but clear. The way the world looks after a long rain, when everything that had been obscured is finally, simply, visible. He had a brother to honor. He had a future to build. He had work to do.